All right. So, you know how like everyone always talks about the UN and NATO and, those big institutions as being like the key to world peace?
Right.
Well, what if they're not? What if they're actually making things worse or at least not really doing much at all? That's what we're going to dive into today with this guy, John J. Mearsheimer.
Yeah.
He's got this article from back in the 90s, The False Promise of International Institutions. And let me tell you, it's a bit of a doozy.
Yeah, it's a classic. It really kind of shakes up the way you think about international relations and the whole idea of global peace.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, we've got these excerpts from his article, and we're going to try to figure out, are institutions really the key to peace, or are they just kind of like a sideshow to the main event?
Right. Yeah, that's the big question. And Mearsheimer, he's coming from this perspective called realism. It often gets a bad rap, like it's all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
But I think it's more about just being like really honest about how the world works.
Yeah. Okay, so Realism 101. Give us the crash course. Why do these realists see the world as such a, scary, dangerous place?
Okay, so imagine like a global highway, right? But there's no traffic rules, no cops, nobody to like enforce anything. Just everyone's speeding towards their own goals,
Oh, wow.
cutting each other off. That's basically the international system, according to realists. It's what they call anarchic, meaning there's no world government to like lay down the law or protect anybody.
So it's just every country for themselves, basically?
Pretty much. And the main way that countries, states, as they call them in international relations, the main way they survive is through power,
Okay.
especially military power. Because, if you're weak, somebody else might just come and take your stuff, or worse.
Yikes. So basically, you got to look out for number one.
Yeah, to a large extent, that's the realist mindset. They say the states can never be totally sure what other states are thinking or planning. Today's friend could be tomorrow's enemy.
Right.
So they're always kind of suspicious and worried about relative power, like how strong they are compared to everybody else.
Okay, I get that. But if everyone's so suspicious all the time, how does anything ever get done? I mean, countries do cooperate, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Realists aren't saying that cooperation never happens,
Okay.
but they see it as like fundamentally fragile,
Yeah.
always shattered by this fear of being cheated
Okay.
or of the other side gaining more from the deal and tipping the balance of power.
Right. That's the relative gains problem you were talking about?
Exactly. It's not just about winning. It's about winning more than the other guy.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that. So, like, even if a deal sounds good on paper, countries are still going to be worried about who comes out on top.
Totally. Think of it like this. The U.S. might be hesitant to sign a trade deal that benefits both them and China,
Okay.
even if it makes them billions of dollars. Because if China benefits even a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
that could boost their economy, maybe help them build a stronger military, and then suddenly the U.S. is at a disadvantage down the line.
Wow. So it's all about thinking long-term and strategically.
Exactly. Realism is all about that long game.
Okay, so that's a pretty, like, cynical view of cooperation. But I guess it makes sense in a way. So where do institutions fit into all this, like the UN and stuff?
Oh, well, this is where Mearsheimer really throws a wrench into things.
Okay.
A lot of folks see these institutions as like the key to peace, right? But realists, they see them as more of a reflection of the existing power dynamics.
Oh, interesting.
Like they're tools used by the strong to stay on top.
So like NATO during the Cold War?
Exactly. They had a ton of power, but was it because of NATO itself or because the U.S. and its allies were already the big dogs on the block?
Oh, right. So the institution itself didn't really matter that much?
That's the realist take. They'd say NATO was a symptom of the Cold War rivalry, not the cure.
Okay, so it's not that institutions are useless according to realists.
Right.
It's just that they have limited power to actually change how countries behave.
Exactly. They're not going to magically transform a lion into a lamb,
So we've got the realist view. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and institutions are kind of just window dressing.
In a nutshell, yeah.
But I know there's another side to this story, right? The institutionalists.
Right.
They're a little more optimistic, aren't they?
Yeah, they definitely see the glass as half full. They believe that institutions can actually make the world less dangerous, less anarchic.
Okay, how so?
Well, they say that by setting rules and reducing uncertainty and just generally making it easier for countries to talk to each other, institutions can create a climate where everyone's a little less scared and a little more willing to cooperate.
So it's not that power doesn't matter.
Right.
It's just that institutions can help countries work together despite those power dynamics.
Exactly. It's a more nuanced view for sure. And to be fair to Mearsheimer, He actually dives into 3 different types of institutionalism,
Oh, wow.
each with its own logic and its own claims about how institutions can promote peace.
3 types. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Lay it on me.
All right, so first up, we've got liberal institutionalism.
Okay.
These guys are mainly focused on economic cooperation. They argue that institutions can help countries overcome the temptation to cheat in trade deals and stuff like that.
Right, right, like those free trade agreements that are always in the news.
Exactly. By setting clear rules, monitoring everyone's behavior, and, having ways to punish cheaters, little liberal institutionalists say we can make cooperation more appealing than going it alone.
That makes sense.
Then we have collective security.
This one's a lot more ambitious. It aims to prevent war outright by having countries basically renounce the use of force entirely
Yeah.
and agree to band together against any aggressor, no matter who it is. It's a beautiful idea in theory.
Yeah, it sounds amazing, but also kind of hard to imagine it working in the real world.
Yeah, you're telling me getting everyone to agree on who the bad guy is and then actually being willing to fight them?
Right.
That's a tall order. And then finally we have critical theory. This is the most radical of the bunch.
Okay, hit me with it.
Critical theorists believe that the world isn't like fixed and unchanging, you know?
They say that our ideas and the way we talk about international relations actually shape reality.
Whoa.
So if we can change the dominant narrative from one of fear and self-interest to one of cooperation and global citizenship, then maybe, just maybe, we can create a more peaceful world.
So if we all just start believing in peace hard enough, it'll magically happen.
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
But the idea is to fundamentally shift the way we think about the world and our place in it.
I mean, I respect the optimism, but it sounds like a pretty tall order.
Yeah, you could say that. And I'm guessing Mearsheimer's not buying it.
You know, he's about to bring the hammer down on all 3 of these theories.
Oh, yeah. He argues that they all miss the point.
Oh.
They fail to grasp just how powerful self-interest is and how competitive the international system really is.
Right.
They're well-intentioned,
Yeah.
but ultimately he thinks they're based on a flawed understanding of how the world works.
Okay, so we've got the realist view. It's all about power, baby.
Haha.
And then we've got the institutionalists trying to find ways to make cooperation work, even in that crazy global highway you described.
Exactly. And now the big question is, can they actually pull it off?
Right.
Or is Mearsheimer right? And are they all doomed to fail? That's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so let's dig into Mearsheimer's critique of these institutionalist theories. I'm especially curious about, liberal institutionalism,
Okay.
because they seem to have a point, right? Institutions do help with stuff like trade deals.
Yeah, for sure. And liberal institutionalists would say that's exactly their point.
Right.
They get that there's always this temptation to cheat,
Uh-huh.
especially in a system where there's no global cop. You know?
Right.
But they think institutions can help by setting clear rules, monitoring what countries are doing, and offering ways to punish those who break the agreements.
So it's like you're making cooperation the more rational choice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're trying to create a system where it makes more sense for countries to play by the rules than to try and pull a fast one.
Okay, that makes sense. But I thought Mearsheimer wasn't really buying this whole institutionalism thing.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. He says liberal institutionalism misses a huge point, and it all comes back to that relative gains problem.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
The idea that even if a deal seems good overall, countries are still going to be worried about who comes out ahead.
Exactly, because even a small gain for your rival could turn into a big problem down the road.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that Mearsheimer shows this isn't just some theoretical idea.
Oh, really?
It actually plays out in the real world, even among democracies.
Oh, wait, democracies?
Yeah, those countries that are supposed to be all about peace and cooperation?
Right. I'm listening.
Well, Mearsheimer points to this research on international communication
Okay.
by a guy named Stephen Krasner. And Krasner found that when it came to things like undersea cables,
Undersea cables.
yeah, those things that carry internet traffic and all that, states were way more concerned about falling behind technologically
Okay.
than they were about other countries cheating on the agreements.
Interesting. So even when cooperation is beneficial, there's still this underlying fear.
Exactly. And that fear is all about relative gains. It's not just about winning. It's about winning more than the other guy.
I see that. So Mearsheimer is saying that liberal institutionalism just doesn't account for this fundamental dynamic.
Right. They assume that states are mainly focused on maximizing their own gains.
Uh-huh.
But in a world where power is everything, states are always looking over their shoulder.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so one point for Mearsheimer. He's shown that Even in the realm of economics, relative gains matter. But what about collective security?
Yeah.
That always seemed a bit like wishful thinking to me.
You and me both, Mearsheimer is pretty skeptical of collective security.
Okay.
And he goes point by point, dismantling its core assumptions.
All right, let's hear it. How does he take down this idea?
Well, first you got to remember what collective security relies on.
Okay.
It's got a lot of ifs.
Okay.
First, states have to give up using force to solve their problems.
Right.
Second, they all have to agree on who the aggressor is in any given conflict.
Uh-huh.
And finally, they have to be willing to actually fight that aggressor.
Yeah, even if it's not directly threatening them.
Exactly. It's a
Yeah.
big ask. And Mearsheimer argues that the real world just doesn't work that way.
Right. I can see that. Like, even figuring out who the bad guy is can be super tricky.
Totally. Think about World War I.
Okay.
Everyone was pointing fingers, blaming each other.
Right. It was a total mess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One country's self-defense is another country's aggression. You know?
Yeah, it's all about perspective.
Right. And then there's the question of whether all conquests are necessarily bad.
Interesting.
Like, what about when Vietnam invaded Cambodia to overthrow the Khmer Rouge?
Right. The Khmer Rouge were committing genocide.
Exactly. So was that a bad conquest?
I mean, I guess not.
Right. But pure collective security wouldn't allow for that kind of nuance.
It's too black and white.
Exactly. The world is just too messy for these absolute rules.
Okay, so that's one problem. What else does Mearsheimer point out?
Well, he also brings up the fact that states have best friends.
Haha, right? Like in real life?
Yeah, allies.
Yeah.
They're not going to turn against no matter what.
So much for collective action.
Right. And even if everyone could agree on who the aggressor is, there's still the issue of who pays for the war.
Yeah, war's expensive.
Super expensive.
Yeah.
So there's a huge incentive for countries to free ride.
Right. Let someone else deal with the problem.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer says this gets to the heart of why collective security just doesn't work.
Okay, why?
Because it requires states to be both terrified of war and totally willing to fight a war at a moment's notice.
Those two things seem kind of contradictory.
Yeah, exactly. You can't be both at the same time.
So he's saying collective security is asking states to act against their own self-interest.
In a way, yeah. It's asking them to put the collective good above their own survival.
Which is a tough sell in a world where there's no global 911 to call.
Right. When it comes down to it, states are going to look out for themselves.
Okay, 2 down, 1 to go.
Yeah.
What about critical theory?
Yes, the idea that we can reshape reality by changing how we talk about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Super interesting. And it's appealing because it challenges this whole notion that the world is just this like fixed, unchanging thing.
Okay.
It says that our ideas actually matter,
Mm-hmm.
that the way we talk about things can actually influence how they turn out.
So if we all start talking about peace and cooperation,
Right.
maybe it'll actually start to happen.
That's the hope. But Mearsheimer's not so sure.
What's his problem with it?
Well, he says that critical theory is better at critiquing the existing system than actually explaining how this big transformation is going to happen.
So it's like they're pointing out what's wrong, but not really offering a solution.
Yeah, kinda.
Yeah.
Like they're saying we need to change the story, but they're not telling us what the new story should be or how we're going to get there.
Yeah, I see that. It's like telling a fish to stop swimming.
Exactly. That's kind of in their nature, you know?
Right, right. So what does Mearsheimer say about this whole idea of changing the narrative?
Well, he uses the example of Gorbachev.
Gorbachev, the Soviet leader.
Yeah. He had this whole new thinking thing going on in the late 80s.
Okay.
Where he was embracing all these more cooperative ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But Mearsheimer asks, did that really change anything fundamental?
Right.
Or was it just a case of a weakening power being forced to adapt?
And then once the pressure was off, they went back to their old ways.
Exactly. So Mearsheimer is skeptical.
I get it. So is he saying critical theory is completely useless?
Not necessarily. He acknowledges that it brings up some important points about the role of ideas in international relations.
Okay.
But he doesn't think it offers a realistic path to lasting peace.
Right. Because at the end of the day, power still matters.
Yeah, self-interest and competition.
Yeah.
Those are powerful forces.
Okay, so we've gone through all 3 theories now. Liberal institutionalism, collective security, critical theory.
Yeah.
And Mearsheimer has basically poked holes in all of them.
He's a tough critic for sure.
But if he's so convinced that institutions aren't the answer, what's his alternative?
Right. Like, is there any hope for a more peaceful world, according to Mearsheimer?
Or are we just stuck in this endless cycle of conflict?
That's the million-dollar question.
Ugh.
And we're going to tackle it head on in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we spent the last two parts like really going in on these institutionalist theories, and Mearsheimer has basically said that all three of them, liberal institutionalism, collective security, and critical theory, just don't really cut it when it comes to explaining how the world actually works.
Yeah, he's pretty much saying they're all based on this kind of naive view of international relations.
Right, like they're ignoring the whole power struggle thing.
Exactly. And the fact that countries, they're always going to be looking out for themselves first and foremost.
So if institutions aren't the answer, then what's the alternative?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Is Mearsheimer just leaving us with this like super bleak picture of the world where conflict is inevitable?
Because it's easy to get kind of pessimistic after hearing all this talk about anarchy and how cooperation is so fragile and, all that.
Well, I wouldn't say Mearsheimer is like an optimist or anything, but he does offer a way forward.
Okay, I'm listening.
And it starts with this really basic idea. Power matters. Like, a lot. He says that if we want to create a more stable world, we got to be honest about how international relations actually work.
So we need to be realistic about realism, I guess.
Haha, exactly. No pun intended.
But really, though, if we're just ignoring these basic dynamics, then we're setting ourselves up for failure.
Right. We're going to end up with these naive policies that just don't work.
Okay, so can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about the League of Nations.
Oh, yeah, that was supposed to prevent another world war, right?
Exactly. It was built on this idea of collective security like we were talking about before,
Uh-huh.
but it totally fell apart when countries like Nazi Germany and Japan decided they weren't going to play by the rules.
Right, they just wanted to expand their power.
And the League just wasn't equipped to handle that.
So Mearsheimer is saying that we need to focus on managing the balance of power instead of hoping that institutions will magically change how countries behave.
Yeah, that's his main argument.
Okay, but what does that actually look like? I mean, does that mean more alliances, more military buildups? Like, that sounds kind of scary.
Well, it's not necessarily about advocating for more conflict,
Okay.
but it is about recognizing that power is a huge factor in how countries make decisions.
Especially when they feel like their survival is at stake.
Exactly. And that means that diplomacy and cooperation, they're still important tools, but they have to be grounded in reality.
You can't just assume that everyone's going to play nice.
Right. You got to understand the power dynamics at play and work with them, not against them.
So it's like having traffic laws that can help things run smoothly. But if people just ignore them, then you're going to have chaos.
You need a system that can deal with the reckless drivers.
Right, right. That makes sense. So basically, Mearsheimer is saying that institutions can be helpful, but they're not a silver bullet. Exactly. They're not going to magically solve all the world's problems.
They can maybe help manage things a little bit.
But at the end of the day, power still matters.
Okay, so I think I'm getting it, but what do you think our listeners, what are your takeaways from all this? If Mearsheimer is right and institutions aren't the answer to preventing war, then what does that mean for us? How should we be thinking about global peace and security?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think it's one that each of us has to grapple with individually. There are no easy answers here.
Right. It's not like we can just snap our fingers and create a perfect world.
But I think the first step is just being aware of these issues. Understanding the complexities of international relations.
And not being naive about how the world works.
Exactly, because if we want to make a difference, we got to be informed and engaged.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, getting people thinking critically about these big issues.
Right, and hopefully sparking some interesting conversations along the way. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the false promise of international institutions. We hope you found it thought-provoking and maybe even a little bit challenging.
Yeah, and if you have any thoughts or questions or just want to keep the conversation going, be sure to connect with us online.
We're always up for a good debate, and we want to hear what you think. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.